All three versions of Session Horn Pro, the performance version, the key switch version, which is what we're looking at here, and the solo instrument version, have not only the main window and the control window, which we've looked at, but they have a sound window, which is used for blending and processing the sound of the horn section, and in the solo instruments version, the individual instruments. Now, in this section, this is an example from a couple of videos ago, we have this brass section with 5 instruments. I'll just play it for you briefly to refresh your memory. And we have the 5 instruments that we can access individually here in the sound panel. We have volume fader, so we can set the relative volume of each of the instruments. And in this slot here, where there's 2 instruments, we have 2 separate faders. We can control the pan position as well for each of the individual instruments. And here the 2 trumpets are panned. I'm going to hard pan them now so we can really hear them separate. And we can control them for the 2 instruments in that slot separately as well. And we have solo and mute buttons for each of the individual instruments, which is really useful, especially when you're using the smart voice split. You can really hear what each individual instrument is doing. So I hear, for example, that this saxophone is in kind of a high register for the way I voice the chord on the keyboard. No problem, we have this drop button which allows us to drop it down by an octave. Let's listen to this sax. I'm going to drop that one down as well. And let's listen to the trumpets. Let's drop that one down. And let's listen to this one. Maybe I'll leave that one up. So with the new blend now, let's listen to those. And of course we can mute individual ones as well. So you can really customize how you want your instruments blended. And we can also process each of the horn sounds individually. Now we have 3 panes here. The first pane, which is selected now, gives us some processing available on a per slot basis. And right now the bass trombone is selected. If I click here, we'll see it's the tenor saxophone, then the alto saxophone, and then trumpet 1 and trumpet 2. And there's a compressor section and an EQ section, and these can be set independently for each of the instruments. Now we also have global send effects and global master effects. We're going to look at those separately in another video. But for now, let's look at this, and we can process with compression and EQ on an individual basis. Now let's solo the trombone and focus on this for a moment. Sounds nice. Now the idea of compression is that we set a threshold for when the compression is going to kick in, and it basically reduces the dynamic range. And once it kicks in, we set a ratio for how many dBs of gain we want it to reduce for each dB it crosses the threshold. So there's compressing a lot. And once the compressor kicks in, when we cross the threshold, we can set an attack value for how long it'll take for the compressor to kick in once the threshold is crossed. And then similarly on release, once the signal is no longer crossing the threshold, how long it takes the compressor to recover back to an uncompressed signal. It's a really quick attack and quick release, so we really hear the compression dramatically. And we have a makeup gain for how many dB of gain we want to add, because this does reduce the level. And then we have a mix control where we can control how much of the uncompressed signal and the compressed signal we want blended together. Let's dial it all the way up so we can really focus just on the compression that's happening now. Yeah, I personally like a slower attack and slower release for a more natural sound in this kind of context. And you can always drive the compression really hard and then just dial in part of it for what's called parallel compression. And you'll see that the controls here are unique for each of the slots, so we can work on each one individually. And since each slot has its own effects, it can be turned on or off with this button here individually for each slot. Now with equalization, again, can be turned on or off individually for each slot. We can shape the frequency response of each instrument, and we do that with these 4 different bands of EQ. We have a low band, which toggles between a shelving EQ and a bell or peak type EQ with this button. And the idea is that we set a frequency over here, and then over here, the amount that we want to either boost or attenuate around that frequency. We have a low mid-range band, a high mid-range band, and then a high frequency band. And these overlap slightly, so we can really get in the cracks and boost or cut where we need or want to. And the high band also can be toggled between a shelf and a regular bell type EQ. Let's listen to trumpet 1, and I'm going to center it for now, just so we can focus on it a bit more closely. So that adds some nice bottom to it. So if I wanted to really thicken up the low end, that would be a nice way to go. Adds a bit of cut. Yeah, and this range of the trumpet, the high band, isn't really adding that much, but the idea is that you shape the frequency spectrum and frequency response of each instrument using these controls. So that's a little overview of the main sound window view. We have volume faders, solo mute buttons, pan controls. Let's just bring that one back down and blend it in a bit better. I'll take it out of solo mode. And we can drop any or all of the instruments individually down an octave, and we have per instrument effects. We have compression, which is turned on or off with that button and then controlled with the knobs here uniquely for each slot, and we have EQ, again unique for each instrument and each instrument in each slot when there's multiple ones like this. Next video we're going to continue and look at the global send and master effects.